Now, to start with the thing about statues, there's been quite a lot of talk about how the Prime Minister, for instance, has said that anyone who knocks down a statue that they disapprove of is anti-democratic, it's the mob rule, and more importantly, I think they're erasing history. So this is the area I want to talk about. I want to talk about what statues represent and whether they are history. Probably not surprisingly, I'm going to say that they're not history in themselves. They're representing a certain view of history, and people put up statues because they want things to be seen in a certain way. And you can see this in some ways by when they're put up. Edward, excuse me, Colston was doing his slave trading in the early 1700s. The statue wasn't put up until the late 1800s. And it was put from a grateful city for his philanthropy. And there'll be a lot of discussion. There's always a lot of discussion saying, well, yes, he may have bought and sold people, but loads of people did in those days. And anyway, he gave a lot of money to the city, which is an argument that is being put across. And I want to challenge this. And I also want to challenge the likes of Labour leader Keir Starmer, who said that it is criminality and has supported the calls for the arrest of the people responsible, which has encouraged the police to go out making arrests. I want to say that this was the beginning of a current movement. It's a movement that's got slave traders' statues either removed or going to be removed in a number of places. It's got people discussing history, and I think far from erasing history, what's happened with this movement is people are now talking about history. They're talking about British history in a way that it hasn't been talked about for a long time. But the getting rid of the statues is not a new thing, and I want to go on to look at what has been in a way the start of the campaign, which was a thing called the Rhodes Must campaign. Now, this is Oriel College in Oxford. It's a part of Oxford University. On the right, you can see a protest outside the gates of the college, and way up above the gate, you can see a statue. Well, there's a number of statues, but the top one, which is the one you can see, is of Cecil Rhodes. Now, Cecil Rhodes, a British imperialist who went out and conquered sections of Africa and became incredibly rich in the process. He was a filthy racist who said that the world should be ruled by the best kind of people, which was white Anglo-Saxons and British ones at that. He was also someone who, as is often the case, was a philanthropist. And one of the things that he did was give money for education, initially so that sons of empire who'd been out conquering the world for Britain, children could come back to study at Oxford. So he set up this Rhodes Scholarship Foundation, and now people are saying that we don't want that anymore. Now, there's been a campaign going on for a number of years around this, saying we don't want to remember someone who is an imperialist and a racist. We don't want them there. We'd rather the statue was elsewhere, like in a museum or something. And what's happened is, following the past few weeks, Oriel College have said they're going to take the statue down. But there's been a campaign for years, and they've not taken it down. And in terms of why now, why Rhodes, it didn't start here. It started in South Africa. In South Africa, at the heart of Cape Town University, this is the heart of Cape Town University, was a statue of Cecil Rhodes for the same reason, that he was a philanthropist who had given money that allowed people to study. And as people who are in favour of the statue staying often point out, it was often black people who got to study these days. And people who've been Rhodes Scholars from around the world include, people may remember the Stuart Hall, the Marxist theoretician and so on. These, but most people are saying less. Why do we keep commemorating and focusing on a white racist? So you have this campaign that was taken up by students and others in the South Africa, and this, as you might be able to see, since that's the plinth for the statue with people dancing on it, was the moment in 2015 when they got rid of the statue. and to argue that that was a celebration worth having because it was changing the way that we look at Rhodes and what he did. Probably Rhodes Memorial was naming a country after himself. He named the country Rhodesia, was named after him. And when it got independence, one of the first things they did was rename it. They didn't want to be named after the white guy who had conquered them and suppressed them. So I'm going to look at different sorts of statues for a minute, but I want to say that the idea that statues are some kind of unchanging history is just weird. And if you look at the most common kind of statue you're likely to see if you wander around Britain is a war memorial. I just want to think, when you look at a war memorial, what do you see? Because what you see varies partly, I think, depending on when they were built. So let's go to London. This is central London. This is Euston Station. Euston Station is a memorial put up out after the First World War, and it's fairly typical of memorials put up at the end of the First World War. Now, they were celebrating a victory, but they were also commemorating enormous loss. They were remembering people who died in their millions, and so that a fairly typical war memorial, and most towns have something similar, they don't all choose, is tired soldiers. They might be victorious, but they're rank and file soldiers and they're looking at. This is partly because the atmosphere at the end of the war was partly of tiredness, but partly of rebellion. And they wanted to control the rebellion by the rulers, and so they wanted to control the rebellion by saying, this is the kind of memorial that we will have. We will say, we respect you workers, the people who actually went out and did the fighting. Now, I think it's very interesting that other times, other sorts of memorials are put up. And if you go around, certainly London, there's probably less of it elsewhere. You will now find memorials to all sorts of people. Here's one. This Arthur Bomber Harris, who was in charge of Bomber Command during the Second World War. And there's a statue to him, as there are to lots of great war leaders. This was put up in 1992. So that what I want to get here, that it wasn't put up at the end of the war. It wasn't put up by the people who worked under him. It was put up as a commemoration years later by governments that wanted to remember a great moment in British history. And I think this is absolutely typical of lots of statues. People want to remember a great moment and they want to remember it in a certain way. Now, outside of South Africa, the biggest movement about statues has not been in Britain, it's been in America. And in America, there has been a move across the South to try and get rid of statue Confederate war leaders that exist in most towns across the South, because the Southern ruling class want to remember their past, one of heroic war leaders and people who fought for just want to remember the really distinctive things about the society they wanted. So this is slave auction in Virginia in 1861. If there was one distinguishing thing about the states, it was the fact that they had slavery. And now you can say an awful lot about other states that also had slavery, but the Confederacy broke away on the basis of slavery. And that was what they were fighting, was to continue having slavery. But they don't actually go on about slavery. They go on about the fact that they were fighting for states' rights. They wanted people to be individual, and they were heroic fighters. And also, I'll come back to it, the war finished in 1865. Most of the statues that were put up in the 1890s or more recently. Some were put up after the Second World War, but they were put up as an attempt to try and re-establish a racism, the Jim Crow laws that were set up, and apartheid that was set up across America's South. So there was something going on there. The statues were there for a particular political purpose. The statues looking at Britain's great past, trying to remember the empire as something that really brought liberation and the Second World War, during the Second World War, don't want to remember about Britain's past. So there are in Britain no statues to the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, where some 80,000 people were put in concentration camps, were locked up and tortured by the British Army in the 1950s. Worth saying that this is after the current Queen, who had had a honeymoon in Kenya, was on the throne. So this is serving memory, but it's not necessarily something that people want to remember, and the rulers. I'll come back to that in later. I also want to talk about something else about statues, which is the idea that there's something terrible about destroying images of people you don't like, because I think this is the sheerest hypocrisy. To start with, let's go back to an unusual image. This is of St. Margaret in a church in Essex. Now, what's unusual about it is it still exists. During the period around the time of the 8th, the period when Protestantism took over in Britain, there was a movement called iconoclasm, which said that people who looked in Catholic churches, there were often statues of saints, and worshipping in those churches was idolatry. So massive crowd of people went round, smashed up the statues. This one is unusual because it was and then bricked behind a wall and was found recently. Most of them were just destroyed. I'm not saying that I necessarily think it was a good thing or a bad thing what happened, but I do think that it was something that was central to the development of Christianity in this country, and it's something which on the whole gets forgotten and left out of histories of what's going on. But let's move to something recent, a bit more political. This is New York in 1766. There's a painting of a statue of King George III, who was the king of America at the time. This is the time when America was fighting for independence, and the revolutionaries, having just declared independence, to, I've forgotten exactly where it was in New York, where the statue was, but they pulled it down. This is something which is remembered in paintings and so on in America as being part of them. And I think that's something that is the case, that it's always seen as being part of liberation. Pulling down statues. So leaping into the 20th century, this is an image that people may, it's from the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, when the Hungary rose up against occupation by Soviet forces, against what they saw, what was argued was as communism. Here they have a statue of Stalin, who was the dictator that they hated, which has been on and smashed up, which is an image which I think most socialists these days feel happy with, seeing workers liberating themselves. I mean, they were just knocked out by Russian tanks soon after that, but that's another time, another talk. However, many socialists might be less pleased to see this. This is from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, a state which called itself socialist. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, had a giant statue of Lenin, or it had a giant statue of Lenin. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, that was pulled down and destroyed. And again, people saw it as part of the challenging the dictatorship that they'd been as such, I don't have a big problem with it. I think it's a pity that there was that Lenin was seen in this way, but giant statues of people who are associated with dictatorships are not necessarily a good thing, and it's often an image that that these will be pulled down. And I think it's interesting to see a famous incident. It's a while ago now, but people may still remember this, which was Saddam Hussein's statue in Baghdad. Now, as things stood, when the Americans first invaded Baghdad, they showed crowds of people, Iraqis, gleefully pulling down the statue of Saddam Hussein. Now, I'm quite sure the majority of Iraqis would happily have pulled down the statue of Saddam Hussein, but as it turned out later on, and this is a photo from slightly further away, it wasn't them that did it. It was the American military that pulled down the statue of Saddam Hussein and wanted to show it as being part of a popular uprising. So it was seen as being something about how people change the way that they look at society. And this is the thing want to keep hammering home at, that this is what's being done with statues being put, whether they're put up or pulled down, is about how a society sees itself and who's in control of that society. This was about America trying to take control of that society and make it look like liberation. So to come back to the Americans, this is the biggest of the Confederate statues that's still standing. It's in Richmond, Virginia, and it's of Robert E. Lee, who was the commander of Confederate forces during the Civil War. So again, it's not people stamping on slave, idea of a heroic war leader figure. It is now scheduled for demolition. This is something which has been going on, but with the Black Lives Matter movement, suddenly all sorts of government had been, state governments, which had been dragging their feet, are suddenly, oh yes, we want to get, and this is something that we're seeing all over the place. And just to go back to Edward Colston, the first statue, the one in Bristol, it is worth saying that people say, well, if they didn't like the statue, why didn't they do something about it? People have been campaigning to have that statue removed for years, and the local council has been dragging its feet over the issue. They've also said it was democratic about how it was put. These statues were not put up in a remotely democratic way. They were put up by leaders who wanted wanted certain things put up. Now, I want to move on to the other side. This has been statues being pulled down. This statue is being pulled down, if you like, by our side. This is the Paris Commune. So this is one of the first workers' uprisings. It was in 1871. Workers took control in Paris, and one of the first things they did, and had their photo taken doing, was pulling down a thing called the Vendome Column, which had a statue of Napoleon on top of it. It becomes part of a thing. It's part of a process about saying who's in charge. This, to me, is positive because it's about the right people being in charge. But over time, statues are about trying to look permanent. And I think that one of the things that we have to look at is that they're often not about permanence. They're not about things lasting indefinitely. I want to go back to another place and another time. People may, if you've ever been to the British Museum, have seen this. This is a statue of Ramesses II. And if that means nothing to you, it's possible that you might know his Greek name, which was Ozymandias. This statue was discovered, it's a fragment, was discovered in the Egyptian desert at the beginning of the 19th century. Now, there was a war going on there at the time between the French and the British. The British won, and therefore the British looted it and said that they were going to take it to London. Which they did. It's still in London in the British Museum. But when news broke of it coming, it inspired the radical poet Shelley to write his poem about how statues last, how rulers don't last, and how you can imagine the desert and this fragment of a statue with its famous thing saying, on the pedestal, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing else remains. And he was celebrating the fact that you can get rid of leaders, they don't last. And this was a leader who wanted to be remembered forever. The original statue was, I've forgotten, 57 feet high. This was someone who wanted a colossal image in order to remind him. It was about making people feel small, and it was about power. And I just want to think, I'm talking about kicking over the statues, knocking down statues of slaveholders, terrible leaders, and so on. What might we want to put up in their place? And this is something that people might want to discuss. Because, for instance, having looked at this statue, would we really rather have Lenin? This is a monumental statue of Lenin in Volgograd. It's still there in Russia. It was overlooking the Volga Canal. Because I think that there's an element to which these kind of monumental statues can end up just being the same thing of trying to make ordinary people look little. And that's not necessarily what I think commemorative art should be about. I think that there's a lot we want to commemorate, but I'd like to discuss how you commemorate it. Are there kinds of public art that are different from this sort of thing? And I would just like to say, having said I'm not really in favour of this kind of monumental art, since Donald Trump made a speech this week from, I've forgotten the name, the big statues of the president carved into a mountain, I wanted to think about the other abilities that were made, because that the mountain is in Mount Rushmore is in Dakota. As a reply, really, to having lots of statues of residents carved into what had been a Native American holy mountain, um, someone started in 1948 trying to carve another mountain in South Dakota to remember Native Americans. This is as far as they've got, and the people are still working on it today. People can see, but down at the bottom left there is what they want the mountain to look like. The Native American leader, Crazy Horse, on horseback, and up is how far they've got. So I say, in general, I'm not wild about carving mountains into the shapes of people, but on the other hand, in this case, as a nation of a people who've suffered genocide, I think that there's an argument for doing it. So what I'd like to say is, I think that what you want in certain in different circumstances depends very much on what you're commemorating. I also think that it's not particularly permanent, because if you carve a mountain, it's relatively permanent, but these statues do not necessarily last forever. And just to give some other examples of things that have been put up, these are two recent statues that have been put up. On the left is a statue that is in Nairobi. That's the capital of Kenya. It was just put up 5 years ago. And what it is a Mau Mau gorilla fighting against the British, and a woman supplying him with food. What's interesting about it, apart from the fact it's relatively little and it's commemorating rebels rather than governments, is who paid for it. It was paid for by Britain. Now, having not wanted to commemorate things to do with the Mau Mau War and the violence that the British government had carried out, a court case in Britain forced the British government to admit that their involvement in it, and to admit that people had been tortured. And part of the settlement for that was agreeing to pay for a statue in central Nairobi to commemorate the people that they'd been torturing. And as such, I think that that's something that I would want to support. On the other hand, on the other side here is a picture of Emmeline Pankhurst, the suffragette leader in Manchester. Now, one of the reasons why there's statues to suffragettes going up at the moment is because it was just the anniversary of women getting the vote. But it's also a thing about trying to suggest that Britain is a stable democratic sort of place where you wouldn't want to cause trouble. So it's easier to have Emmeline Pankhurst, who in the end was much more of an establishment figure than, for instance, Sylvia Pankhurst, who was a much more troublemaker figure. Though, to be fair, I believe that there is a statue of Sylvia Pankhurst which is in the process of being built and should go up in East London. But these are a much more manageable scale. But I just want to finish with that, thinking about, do we actually want to commemorate things by having pictures of individuals? Do you actually want to do other things? Are there types of active art that might commemorate whole groups of people, or different sorts of people? I raise this because I suppose one of the things is, when they say that we're erasing history by getting rid of their leaders, I think that there's whole new amounts of history. A lot of people know an awful lot more history than they knew, just by the arguments that have been going on around statues over the past month or so. And I think that that's been a really positive thing. But I think one of the things we need is to talk about decolonizing the curriculum, getting rid of just accepting ideas from certain establishment figures and the idea that what the establishment is right, but also we want to commemorate other things. And I'd like to think that we can think of ways we might want to commemorate other things. They might not be of individual statues. I think they probably won't be giant statues. But if people want to come in and say what they think we should be doing, I'd be interested to hear. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.